The summer of 2018 came to the Northern California foothills hotter than anyone could remember. By mid-June, the grass on the ridges had turned from green to gold to the color of old bone. The air tasted like dust and pine resin, thick enough to coat the back of your throat with every breath. Maya Castellanos stood at the edge of her 5-acre plot, watching smoke rise from a controlled burn 3 valleys over. The Forestry Service was trying to clear undergrowth before the real fire season hit, before the winds came screaming down from the high country and turned every dried needle, every dead branch, every blade of brittle grass into kindling waiting for a spark. Her neighbors thought she was crazy. They had thought that for 2 years now, ever since she'd started building the cabin with the grass roof, ever since she refused to use composition shingles or metal roofing, or any of the conventional materials that every other structure in Pine Ridge used, ever since she'd explained what she was doing and why, and they had looked at her like she was describing plans to build a house made of matches. "You're putting grass on your roof?" Linda Mercer from property to the east had said, her voice rising with disbelief. "In fire country? Honey, that's like building a funeral pyre and calling a home." Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. Maya hadn't argued. She had learned over the past 2 years that arguing with people who had already decided you were wrong was a waste of breath better spent on the work itself. She had simply nodded and kept building, kept layering sod and native grasses over the thick timber frame, kept watering and tending, and watching the living roof take hold the way her grandmother had taught her it would. Her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, dead now for 5 years, but present in every decision Maya made, every measurement she took, every principle she applied to the structure rising slowly from the red California earth. Rosa Castellanos had been born in a village in the Sierra Madre of Mexico, a place where houses wore roofs of earth and grass, because that was what the land provided. And what the land provided was always enough if you knew how to work with it. She had immigrated north in 1962, married Maya's grandfather, raised 4 children in Sacramento, and never stopped talking about the old ways. The ways that didn't require money or fancy materials, or the approval of people who thought progress meant building with petroleum products and calling it modern. "The earth protects itself," Rosa used to say, sitting on her porch in the Sacramento heat, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. "Fire burns what is dry. But living earth, earth with roots holding moisture, that is different. That is patient. Fire gets tired of patience." Maya had been 12 when her grandmother first explained it. 27 when the car fire burned through Redding and killed her parents in their suburban home with a composition roof that melted in the heat, that dripped flaming tar onto everything below, that turned a structure meant to shelter into an oven that cooked everything inside. She had been 29 when she finally stopped trying to live in the city, stopped trying to pretend that the nightmares would fade, stopped trying to build a life in places where every smoke alarm made her freeze, where every hot day made her stomach clench with ancestral dread that she couldn't name but could always feel. She was 31 now, and she was building something that would survive what killed her parents. Or she was building a monument to her own grief. She wasn't sure which. Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter as long as the work got done. The cabin measured 20 feet by 24, larger than she needed, but sized according to principles her grandmother had sketched in a journal Maya had found after the funeral. The walls were straw bale, 18 inches thick, covered inside and out with 3 coats of lime plaster that had cured the hardness of stone. The windows were small, double-paned, positioned to catch the winter sun and avoid the prevailing winds that blew from the northwest during fire season. And the roof that everyone mocked, the roof that would prove them all wrong or prove her insane. She wasn't sure which yet, but she would find out. The structure was complicated in ways that conventional roofing never bothered with. First came the timber frame, thick Douglas fir beams salvaged from an old barn that had collapsed 2 counties over. Maya had spent 3 months dismantling that barn, pulling nails, cleaning lumber, hauling it back to her property in a borrowed truck that broke down twice on the mountain roads. The beams formed a solid structure, engineered to carry weight that a normal roof would never have to bear. Because living earth was heavy, wet earth was heavier, and earth saturated by the irrigation system she planned to install would be heavier still. Hundreds of pounds per square foot pressing down on the frame below, testing every joint, every connection, every decision she had made about load and stress and the mathematics of things that wanted to fall but couldn't be allowed to. Over the beams went a layer of tongue-and-groove planking, tight-fitted pine that created a solid deck. Over that went a waterproof membrane, not the standard tar paper that would break down in a few years, but a modern synthetic barrier that would last decades, that would flex with the wood's seasonal movement without tearing, without creating gaps where water could find its way through. Then came the crucial layer, the one her grandmother had emphasized in every sketch, every note, every conversation they'd had about traditional building, a root barrier made from thick pond liner, the kind designed to hold water in place for 20 years or more. This barrier would keep the grass roots from penetrating down into the wood below, would keep the living roof from becoming a living threat to the structure it was meant to protect. Over the root barrier went 8 inches of growing medium, not topsoil, which was too heavy, but a carefully mixed blend of lightweight aggregates, compost, and native soil that would drain quickly, that would support plant life without becoming waterlogged, that would stay moist enough to resist fire, but never so wet that it collapsed under its own weight. And finally, the grass itself. Not Kentucky bluegrass or rye or any of the thirsty ornamental species that belonged in suburbs with sprinkler systems and weekend lawn care. Native bunch grasses that had evolved here, that knew how to survive the long, dry summers and come back green with the first fall rains. Blue grama, Idaho fescue, California oakgrass, species that sent roots deep, that held soil in place, that stayed green longer into the summer than anything imported ever could. She had planted them herself, working through the early spring of 2017, pressing seeds into the growing medium by hand, watering carefully, watching the first green shoots emerge and spread and knit together into a living mat that covered the roof like a meadow growing sideways against the sky. Her neighbors had come to watch. They always came to watch. Watching someone fail was entertainment in a rural community where there wasn't much else to do. Tom Brennan from across the road had stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. "That grass is going to die by July," he said. "Then what? You got a pile of dead kindling up there just waiting for a spark." "It won't die," Maya had said, not looking up from her work. "Native grasses have deep roots. They go dormant in summer, but they don't die." "Dormant looks a hell of a lot like dead when the fire comes through," Tom said. "And fire's coming. It always comes." He wasn't wrong about that. Fire always came to these foothills. It had come in 2017. It had come in 2016 and 2015, and every year before that as far back as anyone could remember. Some years it came close. Some years it burned right through, taking houses and barns and everything people had spent their lives building. The Carr Fire had been one of the bad ones. 6 people dead. Over 1,000 homes destroyed. Maya's parents among the dead. Their house among the ashes. She had gone back to see it afterward, standing in what used to be the living room, looking at the twisted remains of the television, the melted picture frames, the places where her childhood had been and now wasn't. The composition roof had failed first, the asphalt shingles curling and burning, dripping flaming tar through the attic and into the rooms below. The fire had worked from the top down, methodical, unstoppable, giving her parents no chance at all. She had stood there in the ash and made herself a promise. If she ever built a home, it would not burn the way theirs had burned. It would not fail from the top down. It would not kill her the way conventional materials had killed the people she loved most. That promise had brought her here, to this 5-acre plot on the edge of Pine Ridge, to this community of people who thought she was touched in the head, to this cabin rising slowly from earth and straw, and wood and living grass. She watered the roof every 3 days during the summer, running a soaker hose along the ridge line, letting moisture seep into the growing medium, keeping the root zone damp even when the air temperature hit 105 degrees. The grass stayed green longer than anything else in the valley, while her neighbors' lawns turned brown by mid-June, while the wild grasses on the hills faded to gold and then to bone white. Her roof stayed verdant, a bright island of green in an ocean of desiccated landscape. "You're wasting water," Linda Mercer had called across the property line one evening in late June. Watering a roof. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard." Maya had just smiled and kept working. She had learned not to explain. Explanation required people to listen, and people who had already decided you were wrong rarely bothered with that. But the water wasn't wasted. Every gallon she put into that roof was insurance. Every day the grass stayed green was another day of protection, because green grass didn't burn. Living plants with moisture in their cells didn't ignite the way dead fuel did. Her grandmother had known that. The people in the Sierra Madre had known that for centuries. And now Maya knew it too. She had installed a secondary irrigation system as well, hidden beneath the growing medium. Drip lines that could saturate the roof completely in less than an hour. She had connected it to a 5,000-gallon water tank buried on the north side of the cabin, filled by a well she had drilled herself with a rented auger and 3 days of backbreaking work. If fire came close, she could flood the roof. She could turn the entire structure into a wet sponge that would resist ignition even under direct flame exposure. That was the theory, anyway. The theory her grandmother had described. The theory she had tested in small-scale experiments, burning dried grass next to saturated grass, watching how fire raced through one and died against the other. But theory and reality were different things. In reality and fire, country was written in ash and loss, and a kind of heat that turned sand to glass. The summer deepened. The controlled burns continued, each one sending smoke into the valley, each one a reminder that fire season was here and building towards something no one could predict, but everyone could feel. The Forestry Service issued warnings. Red flag days when any spark could start a conflagration. Evacuation plans distributed to every home in the county. Maya checked her systems obsessively. The water tank stayed full. The irrigation line stayed clear. The roof stayed green, greener than seemed possible in the July heat, greener than anything else for miles. And her neighbors kept watching, kept shaking their heads, kept predicting disaster. "When that cabin burns," Tom Brennan said one afternoon, standing at the edge of her property with his hands shoved in his pockets, "don't come crying to us for help." "It won't burn," Maya had said, not defensively, not argumentatively, just stating a fact she believed with everything she had. Tom had laughed, not meanly, but with the patient condescension of someone who knew better, who had lived in fire country for 40 years, who had seen what fire could do and knew that no amount of wishful thinking or crazy ideas about grass roofs would change the fundamental reality of wood and heat and oxygen. "Everything burns," he said. "That's the first lesson you learn in these mountains. Everything burns eventually." Then he had walked away, and Maya had gone back to watering her roof, to checking her systems, to waiting for the test she knew was coming. It came on July 31st, a Tuesday. The temperature had been over 100 for 6 straight days. The humidity had dropped below 10%. The winds had shifted, coming now from the northeast, hot and dry and relentless, pushing down from the high deserts and turning the foothills into a convection oven. The spark came from a car on Highway 299, a catalytic converter scraping on the pavement, throwing sparks into the dry grass on the shoulder. Within an hour, the fire had jumped the road and was racing up the canyon walls. Within 3 hours, it had consumed 2,000 acres and was moving toward Pine Ridge at a speed that made evacuations nearly impossible. Maya heard about it on the radio first, then saw the smoke rising to the east, a column of gray and black that towered into the sky, like a pillar supporting the heavens. Then her phone buzzed with the evacuation order. Mandatory evacuation. Leave now. Take only what you can carry. Go. She stood in her cabin, looking around at everything she had built, everything she had poured herself into for 2 years. The straw bale walls, the lime plaster she had mixed and spread by hand, the windows she had installed, the floor she had sanded and sealed, the life she had constructed from grief and determination and her grandmother's old knowledge. The radio said the fire was 3 miles away and moving fast. Her truck was packed with essentials, documents, photos, her grandmother's journal. She could leave right now and be safe. That was what everyone else was doing. The valley was emptying, a stream of vehicles heading west toward the fire lines and safety. But Maya looked up at her roof, at the green grass growing there, at the irrigation system she had built precisely for this moment. And she made a decision. She wasn't leaving. She was going to prove something. To herself, to her grandmother's memory, to everyone who had mocked her and predicted failure. She was going to stay, and her cabin was going to survive, and when the smoke cleared, she would still be standing. Or she would die proving that grief could make you brave enough to be stupid. She honestly wasn't sure which. Maya moved with the efficiency of someone who had planned for this moment in every detail, even if some part of her had hoped it would never come. She started with the water tank, opening the main valve that fed the irrigation system. The drip lines hidden beneath the growing medium began to flood the roof, saturating 8 inches of soil and root mass with thousands of gallons of well water. She could hear it working, a soft rushing sound as moisture spread to the growing medium, as the native grasses drank deep, as the entire structure became something closer to a wetland than a roof. The grass, already green from her regular watering schedule, darkened to the deep emerald color of vegetation at its peak hydration. Moisture began to beat on the blades, to drip from the eaves, to turn the entire roof into a living sponge that held water the way her grandmother had promised it would. Next, she moved to the cabin, closing every window, sealing every vent. The straw bale walls were already rated for 2-hour fire resistance, the lime plaster providing a hard, non-combustible shell around the organic core. But she wasn't taking chances. She stuffed towels under the door, taped over the small gaps where pipes entered the walls, created as close to an airtight seal as she could manage. The cabin had a cellar, a root storage space she had dug by hand, 8 feet deep with walls lined in stone, and a heavy wooden door that closed flush with the floor. She opened it now, checking the supplies she had stored there for exactly the scenario. Water in 5-gallon jugs, canned food, a battery-powered radio, blankets, a fire extinguisher that probably wouldn't matter if things went truly wrong, but gave her something to hold on to anyway. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Linda Mercer. "Get out now. Fire jumped the ridge. Moving fast." Maya looked out the south window. The smoke was closer now, a roiling mass of gray and orange that obscured the ridgeline completely. She could see spot fires starting on the hills below, embers carried ahead of the main fire front by winds that were gusting to 40 miles per hour. The air had taken on a quality she remembered from the car fire, a thickness that wasn't quite smoke yet, but wasn't quite clear either, a promise of what was coming. She texted back, "I'm staying. Cabin will hold." The response came immediately, "You're insane." Maybe, probably, but she was committed now. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear that made her hands shake and her breath come short, was something else. A certainty, a knowledge that came from her grandmother's voice in her head, from 2 years of building and testing and preparing, from the simple fact that she had done everything right, and now it was time to see if right was enough. She went back outside one more time, did a final check of the property. The cabin sat in a clearing she had expanded specifically for this purpose, a defensible space of 60 feet in every direction where she had removed every tree, every shrub, every blade of dry grass. The ground was bare dirt and gravel, nothing to carry fire close to the structure itself. Her neighbors had thought that was crazy too. "You're making it look like a bomb site," Tom Brennan had said when she was clearing the land. "Trees provide shade. They cool the place down." "Trees burn," Maya had replied. "Shade doesn't matter if you're dead." Now, standing in that clearing, feeling the wind pick up and the temperature rise as the fire drew closer, she was grateful for every tree she had removed, every hour she had spent with chainsaw and shovel, creating distance between her cabin and the fuel that fed wildfires. The main fire front was visible now, a line of orange crawling over the eastern ridge like some slow apocalypse. The sound reached her before the heat did, a roar that wasn't quite like anything else. Wind and combustion, and the crackling of a million dried needles igniting simultaneously. It was the sound of the world ending, compressed into a single advancing wall. Maya went inside, sealed the door behind her, and opened the cellar. She climbed down the ladder with her supplies, pulled the heavy door closed over her head, and sat in the darkness with her battery radio and her grandmother's journal and the certainty that the next few hours would either prove her right or kill her trying. The fire reached Pine Ridge at 4:47 p.m. Maya knew the time because she was listening to the emergency broadcast, the dispatcher's voice crackling through the static as she called out street names and evacuation zones, as she reported structures burning, as she coordinated with fire crews who were completely overwhelmed by a fire that was moving faster than anyone had predicted. Multiple structures involved on Canyon Road. The dispatcher said, her voice professionally calm despite the chaos. All units be advised, winds gusting to 50. This is an explosive fire situation. Canyon Road was 2 streets over from Maya's property. Half a mile away, maybe less. She sat in the darkness of the cellar and felt the temperature begin to rise. Not drastically, not the sudden killing heat she had feared, but a gradual warming that told the fire was close, that it was consuming the world above her, that her cabin was being tested in ways that would break most structures within minutes. The sound changed. The distant roar became immediate. A freight train passing directly overhead. Wind and fire merged into something that vibrated through the earth itself. She could hear things hitting the cabin. Embers, debris, chunks of burning material thrown ahead of the main fire and raining down on everything in their path. This was when composition roofs failed. She knew. When the embers landed in the valleys and eaves. When they found dried leaves in the gutters. When they ignited the petroleum-based shingles and started the structure burning from the top down. This was when metal roofs superheated, when they transferred killing temperatures to the attic spaces below, when they turned homes into ovens. But her roof was wet. Her roof was living earth and saturated grass. Her roof had no gutters to fill with debris, no petroleum products to ignite, no metal to conduct heat. Her roof was 8 inches of thermal mass that would absorb temperature slowly, that would protect the wooden structure beneath through its sheer density and moisture content. That was the theory. She listened to things burn above her, heard what might have been her rain barrels exploding from the heat, heard what was definitely trees falling in the forest beyond her clearing, heard the wind screaming through her property with a force that made the cellar door rattle in its frame. And then gradually the sound began to change. The roar diminished. The freight train passed. The wind dropped from 50 miles per hour to 40, to 30, to something that no longer threatened to tear the world apart. The main fire front had passed over a property in approximately 17 minutes. 17 minutes that felt like hours. 17 minutes during which everything she had built was either surviving or being reduced to ash. She wouldn't know which until she opened the cellar door. She waited, not from cowardice, though she was terrified of what she might find, but because opening the door too soon, while superheated air still lingered, while embers still fell, would be suicidal. She had read the survival guides. She knew that more people died in the minutes after a fire passed than during the fire itself, emerging too soon, breathing air hot enough to sear their lungs, making the mistake of thinking survival meant the danger was over. She waited in the darkness for an hour. Then another. The radio continued its reports. Pine Ridge had been hit hard. Multiple structures confirmed destroyed. Fire crews unable to access the area due to downed power lines and trees blocking the roads. Residents advised to shelter in place if they had not already evacuated. At 7:15 p.m., 3 hours after the fire front passed, Maya climbed the ladder and pushed open the cellar door. Smoke poured into the cellar, thick and choking, but not the killing heat she had feared. She covered her mouth with a damp cloth and climbed out into her cabin. The interior was intact, walls standing, ceiling solid above her. The windows had cracked from the temperature differential, spiderweb but not shattered. The door had warped slightly in its frame, but remained closed. Everything was covered in a fine layer of ash that had found its way through gaps she hadn't known existed. But the structure itself had held. She moved to the door, opened it carefully, and stepped outside into a landscape transformed. The world had become monochrome. Everything was black or gray, with a dull red of still glowing embers. The trees beyond her clearing were gone, reduced to standing snags or fallen completely. The grass that had covered the hills was ash. The sky was the color of old smoke, and the air tasted like the end of things. But her cabin stood. Maya walked around the structure slowly, her legs shaking, her breath coming in short gasps that might have been relief or shock or the beginning of tears. She hadn't let herself cry yet. The straw bale walls were scorched on the exterior, the lime plaster darkened by smoke and heat, but intact. Not a single ember had penetrated to the combustible straw inside. The small windows it held, cracked but not broken. The door had sealed well enough to keep the worst of the smoke out. And the roof. Maya climbed the ladder she kept against the north wall, hauled herself onto the structure, and stood on top of her cabin looking at something she could barely believe. The grass was gone, burned away by the radiant heat and embers that had rained down during those 17 minutes. But the growing medium beneath was intact, still dark with moisture, still holding together. The roots of the native grasses, driven deep into that 8-inch layer, had protected the soil from complete combustion. And more importantly, the thick layer of wet earth had protected the wooden structure beneath. She knelt down, brushed away ash, and felt the planking below. Warm, but not hot. Slightly charred on the surface where embers had landed and smoldered before the moisture content extinguished them, but solid. The waterproof membrane had held. The root barrier had held. The entire system had functioned exactly as her grandmother's designs had promised it would. Her cabin had survived a wildfire that had destroyed half of Pine Ridge. She sat down on her wet, ash-covered roof and finally let herself cry. Not from grief this time, but from something else. Vindication. Relief. The overwhelming weight of having been right when everyone said she was wrong. Of having trusted knowledge that came from her grandmother's old country, from centuries of people who understood that the earth protected itself if you let it. The tears mixed with ash on her face, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Below her in the distance, she could see smoke rising from where her neighbors' homes had stood. Not all of them were destroyed. She could see Tom Brennan's place still standing, and what looked like the Miller house on the ridge. But Linda Mercer's home was gone. The Johnsons' barn had burned. The structures with conventional roofing, with composition shingles and no defensible space, had failed exactly the way she had known they would. She felt no satisfaction in their loss. Only a deep sadness that it had to be proven this way, that knowledge had to be validated by disaster, that people had to lose everything before they would consider that maybe, just maybe, there were better ways to build. Her phone buzzed. Multiple texts coming through now that the cell towers were working again. Her neighbors who had evacuated, checking to see if anyone had stayed, if anyone needed help. She texted back to the group chat, "I'm alive. Cabin is standing. If anyone needs shelter, I have space." The responses came quickly. Disbelief. Questions. Someone asking if she was serious, if her cabin with the crazy grass roof had really survived. "Come see for yourself," she texted back. They came at first light. Tom Brennan, in his truck, navigating the debris-strewn road carefully. Linda Mercer with her husband, their faces showing the shock of people who had lost their home and couldn't quite process it yet. The Johnsons, the Millers, other neighbors Maya barely knew, drawn by the radio reports that one structure in the direct path of the fire had survived intact. They stood in her clearing, looking at her cabin, scorched, smoke-darkened, the grass roof gone to ash and bare earth, but standing, solid, undamaged in any way that mattered. "How?" Tom Brennan asked. Just that one word, but it contained everything. Disbelief, confusion, the beginning of understanding that maybe he had been wrong. Maya climbed down from a roof where she had spent the night, too wired to sleep, watching for spot fires and thinking about her grandmother's journal. "The earth," she said simply. "Fire burns what's dry, but wet earth doesn't burn. Living roots hold moisture even when the grass above dies back. 8 inches of saturated soil is better insulation than anything we can manufacture." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories like this one. "But the grass burned," Linda said, looking at the ash-covered roof. "We saw it. We thought." "The grass was a sacrifice layer," Maya explained. "It burned so the structure beneath wouldn't. That's how it's supposed to work. The thermal mass absorbs the heat. The moisture prevents the wood from reaching ignition temperature. By the time the fire passed, the worst of the energy had been dissipated into the soil." She pulled out her grandmother's journal, the pages now ash-smudged but still readable. "My grandmother's village built like this for 300 years. They had wildfires. They had droughts. But their homes survived because they understood that you don't fight the Earth's processes. You work with them. Tom took the journal carefully, turning pages filled with sketches and notes in Spanish, diagrams showing cross-sections of roofs with measurements and annotations. I've never seen anything like this. Most people haven't, Maya said. We forgot. We decided modern materials were better without asking better at what? Better at profit margins, maybe. Better at ease of installation, but not better at surviving fire. The group stood in silence, looking from the journal to the cabin, processing what they were seeing. Finally, Tom handed the journal back. Can you teach us? He asked. I need to rebuild. Linda needs to rebuild. Half the valley needs to rebuild. He paused. I don't want to rebuild the same way just to watch it burn again in 5 years. Maya looked at the faces around her. People who had mocked her. People who had predicted her failure. People who were now asking for help because disaster had taught them what her words never could. She thought about her grandmother, about the promise she had made standing in the ashes of her parents' home, about knowledge that deserved to survive, to spread, to protect people the way it had protected her. Yes, she said, I'll teach you. The fire burned for 6 more days before the weather changed and the first autumn rains came to the Northern California foothills. By the time the flames were fully contained, the Cascade Fire, as it was being called by the news media, had consumed 42,000 acres, destroyed 117 structures, and killed 3 people who had tried to evacuate too late. Pine Ridge was in the direct path of the destruction. The small community of 38 homes had been reduced to 19 standing structures. The rest were ash and twisted metal, and the kind of memories that would haunt survivors for years. Maya's cabin became a gathering point almost immediately, not just because it had survived, but because it was proof that survival was possible, that with different techniques, different materials, different thinking, homes could stand against fire instead of feeding it. The first meeting happened 3 days after the fire passed. Maya had cleared space in her cabin, moved her few possessions against the walls, and set up folding chairs borrowed from the community center that had somehow survived 2 miles down the valley. 19 people came, everyone who still had a home in Pine Ridge, and several who didn't but were living in tents on their burned properties, unwilling to leave even though there was nothing left to protect. Tom Brennan spoke first. Most of us need to rebuild. Insurance will cover it eventually, but we need to make decisions about what we're rebuilding and how. He looked around the room. I think we all know now that doing the same thing and expecting different results is insanity. Linda Mercer raised her hand. Before we start, I need to say something. She looked at Maya, her eyes red from smoke and crying in sleepless nights. I'm sorry for what I said, for mocking you. You tried to tell us, and we didn't listen. Maya shook her head. You don't need to apologize. You didn't know. None of us really knows until we see it. But you did know, Linda insisted. And we treated you like you were crazy. My grandmother knew, Maya corrected gently. I just listened to her. And I'm willing to share what she taught me with anyone who wants to learn. She spread her grandmother's journal on the table, along with the detailed notes she had made during her own building process. Photographs showing each layer of construction, diagrams explaining water retention, root barriers, growing medium composition, irrigation systems. 2 years of careful documentation that suddenly had value beyond her own satisfaction. The principle is simple, Maya began. Fire needs 3 things: fuel, oxygen, and heat. We can't eliminate oxygen. We need to breathe. And we can't eliminate heat during a wildfire. But we can change what the fuel is, how it behaves, and whether it reaches ignition temperature. She pulled out a piece of burned grass from her roof, held it up. This was a fuel. It burned, but it burned slowly, and it protected everything beneath it because the soil was rooted and was saturated with water. 8 inches of wet earth is a thermal barrier that conventional roofing materials can't match. What about maintenance? Asked Robert Johnson, whose barn had burned but whose house had survived because it sat in the middle of an irrigated pasture. Composition shingles you just put up and forget. A living roof sounds like constant work. It is work, Maya acknowledged, but less than you'd think. The native grasses I planted are adapted to this climate. They don't need much water except during fire season, and they don't need mowing or fertilizing. The main maintenance is keeping the irrigation system clear and checking the roof for damage twice a year. Maybe 6 hours of work total annually, versus replacing your entire roof every 15 years, Tom pointed out, or rebuilding your entire house when it burns down. Exactly, Maya said, and there are other benefits. The thermal mass regulates temperature year-round. My cabin stays cooler in summer and warmer in winter than conventional construction. My heating and cooling costs are about a third of what they'd be with standard framing and composition roofing. She walked them through the complete system, the importance of the defensible space she had created, the straw bale walls with lime plaster, which had proven remarkably fire-resistant, the small, well-sealed windows, the cellar for emergency shelter. But mostly she focused on the roof, because that was where most structures failed. The key is understanding that you're not just building a roof, she explained. You're building a living system. The grass, the soil, the roots, the moisture, they all work together. Remove any element and the system fails. She showed them her irrigation setup, the buried water tank, the drip lines that could saturate the growing medium in less than an hour. This is crucial. Without the ability to wet the roof quickly when fire threatens, you're just putting dry fuel up there. The moisture is what makes the difference between protection and kindling. A woman named Sarah Chun, who had lost her home and was staying with relatives in the valley, asked the question Maya had been waiting for. How much does it cost, compared to conventional roofing? Maya had done the math. She had spreadsheets. Initial construction is about 30% more expensive than composition shingles, mostly because of the structural requirements for carrying the additional weight. But it's actually cheaper than metal roofing, and the longevity is much better. A properly built living roof can last 50 years or more with basic maintenance. 50 years? Tom looked skeptical. There are turf roofs in Scandinavia that are over 200 years old, Maya said. My grandmother's village had roofs that passed from generation to generation. The growing medium needs to be replenished occasionally, and you might need to replant sections of grass if damage occurs, but the basic structure lasts longer than the building beneath it. The questions continue for hours. Specific details about soil mixture ratios, plant species selection, waterproofing techniques, weight calculations, building code compliance. That last one was particularly thorny since no code enforcement officer in California had ever approved a living roof for fire country. The code is going to be a problem, admitted George Miller, who had worked in construction before retiring. Standard building codes aren't written with this kind of system in mind. Then maybe it's time to change the codes, Maya said quietly. How many more fires do we need before we admit that the standard approach isn't working? The room went silent. Everyone was thinking about the same thing. The homes they had lost, the neighbors who had died, the fires that would come again next summer and the summer after that, because climate change wasn't stopping and the forests weren't becoming less flammable. I'll talk to the county, Tom said finally. My brother-in-law is on the planning commission. If we can document that this system works, and we got pretty dramatic proof sitting right here, maybe we can get a variance for experimental construction techniques. It's not experimental, Maya pointed out. It's ancient. We're just remembering what we forgot. Over the following weeks, Maya's cabin became something between a classroom and a pilgrimage site. People came from neighboring communities, from fire-affected areas throughout the state, from academic institutions studying wildfire resilience. A researcher from UC Berkeley spent 3 days measuring moisture retention in Maya's roof, taking samples of the growing medium, documenting the char patterns on the wooden structure beneath. This is remarkable, Dr. Patricia Reeves said, kneeling on the ash-covered roof with her instruments. The thermal protection is even better than I expected. The wood beneath never reached more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit during the fire. Ignition temperature for wood is around 570. You had a safety margin of over 300 degrees. My grandmother would say that's because the earth knows how to protect itself, Maya said. Dr. Reeves smiled. Your grandmother was essentially correct, even if she phrased it poetically. The combination of thermal mass, moisture content, and the ablative layer of grass created a composite system that's superior to any manufactured roofing material for wildfire resistance. Can you tell that to the building inspector? Maya asked, I can do better than that. I can publish it. The paper that Dr. Reeves eventually published in the Journal of Sustainable Architecture became the foundation for changing California's building codes regarding alternative roofing systems in fire-prone areas. But that took months. In the meantime, Maya had more immediate concerns. Tom Brennan wanted to rebuild using her techniques. So did Linda Mercer. So did 5 other families whose homes had burned. They needed detailed plans, material lists, construction guidance. They needed someone to walk them through every step of a building process that none of them had ever attempted. Maya found herself becoming something she had never intended to be, a teacher, an expert, a voice for techniques that her grandmother had carried north from Mexico 60 years ago. She held workshops every Saturday in her cabin, teaching groups of 10 or 12 people at a time. She showed them how to mix lime plaster, how to stack and pin straw bales, how to calculate roof loads and size water tanks, and select native plant species. She shared her grandmother's journal freely, making copies of the pages, translating the Spanish notes into English, adding her own annotations based on what she had learned. You don't have to do it exactly the way I did, she always told them. Every site is different. Every building is different, but the principles stay the same. Thermal mass, moisture retention, native plants adapted to the climate, work with the land, not against it. Tom broke ground on his new home in November, after the rains had settled the ash and the risk of erosion had passed. Maya was there the day they poured the foundation, watching as he positioned the structure exactly where his old house had stood, but with different orientation, different materials, different thinking about what it meant to build in fire country. I keep thinking about the old house, Tom said, standing in the rain with his plans rolled under his arm. All those years we lived there, raised our kids there. I thought it was solid, you know? Thought we'd done everything right. You did what everyone did, Maya said. What we were all taught to do. That's not your fault. Still feel like an idiot for not listening to you. You're listening now. That's what matters. By spring, 3 homes were under construction using variations of Maya's design. By summer, 5 more had broken ground. The local news ran a story about the Phoenix community rising from fire with ancient techniques. A Los Angeles Times reporter spent a week in Pine Ridge, interviewing survivors and documenting the rebuilding process. The article featured Maya prominently, though she had tried to deflect attention. It's not about me, she told the reporter. It's about remembering knowledge that we almost lost. My grandmother's village in Mexico, the Scandinavian turf roofs, the sod houses of the Great Plains. Humans have been building with earth for thousands of years in fire-prone, flood-prone, storm-prone environments. We just forgot because we fell in love with cheap materials and fast construction. The article ran with a photo of Maya standing on her grass roof, now replanted with new native grasses that were already greening up with the spring rains. Behind her, the scarred hillside was slowly recovering, new growth pushing through the ash, the forest beginning the long process of regeneration. The phone call started after that. Architects wanted to consult on designs. Homeowners in fire zones wanting to learn. Insurance companies asking if living roofs qualified for reduced premiums. The calls kept coming, more than Maya could handle alone while still maintaining her own property and helping her neighbors rebuild. She needed help. She needed to systematize what she knew, to create resources that could spread this knowledge faster and further than she could teach in person. That's when she thought of Rosa, not her grandmother, though she thought of Abuela Rosa every day, but Rosa Sanchez, a young woman from Sacramento who had driven up to Pine Ridge after reading the Times article. Rosa was a landscape architect who specialized in native plant systems, and she had approached Maya with an idea. I want to help, Rosa had said. I have the technical skills for design and permitting. You have the practical knowledge and the credibility. Together, we could create a nonprofit, educational workshops, open-source building plans, advocacy for code changes, make this accessible to anyone who needs it. Maya had been hesitant at first. She wasn't an organization person. She was a builder, someone who worked with her hands, who preferred solitude and quiet to meetings and bureaucracy. But then she thought about her grandmother's journal, the knowledge that almost died with Rosa Castellanos, that would have been lost forever if Maya hadn't found it and tested it and proven it could save lives. Knowledge that important couldn't belong to just one person. It needed to spread. It needed to survive beyond her. Okay, Maya had said, let's do it. The Pine Ridge Center for Fire Resilient Building opened 18 months after the Cascade Fire, operating out a new structure that Maya and Rosa had designed together. The building itself was a demonstration project. Straw bale walls, living roof, solar panels, rainwater catchment. All the principles they wanted to teach embodied in the structure where they taught them. The first workshop had 60 participants. The second had over 100. By the end of the first year, they had trained more than 800 people in fire-resilient building techniques. Architects came from across the country. Homeowners traveled from Montana, Colorado, Oregon, anywhere fire was reshaping how people thought about construction. Maya still lived in her original cabin. She had replanted the roof with native grasses that now grew thick and green, a meadow suspended against the sky. She had repaired the cracked windows, replastered the smoke-damaged walls, but she had left some char marks visible as a reminder of what the structure had survived. On the second anniversary of the Cascade Fire, the community of Pine Ridge held a memorial service. They gathered at the small cemetery where the 3 victims were buried, where family members and survivors came to remember and to acknowledge how close they had all come to joining them. After the service, people walked to Maya's property. Tom Brennan's new home stood completed now on his lot, its living roof green and thriving. Linda Mercer's house was nearly finished, the straw bale walls up and plastered, the roof framing ready for its layers of protection. 5 other homes in various stages of construction dotted the community, all of them built using principles that 2 years ago had seemed crazy. They gathered in Maya's clearing, 40 or 50 people, and someone asked her to say a few words. Maya stood on the porch of her cabin, looking at the faces assembled before her neighbors, her students, her community that had been forged through loss and rebuilt through learning. 2 years ago, she began, my grandmother's knowledge saved my life, but it almost didn't because I almost didn't listen. I grew up hearing her stories about the old ways, about building with earth and grass, and I dismissed it as old country nostalgia, quaint, but not relevant to modern life. She paused, feeling the weight of what she needed to say. It took losing my parents to make me listen. It took grief to make me understand that maybe the old ways survived because they were better ways. Not easier, not cheaper in the short term, but better at the only thing that really matters, keeping people alive. The crowd was silent, everyone remembering their own losses, their own moments of understanding. We've built or are building 9 homes here using these techniques, Maya continued. 9 homes that will still be standing the next time fire comes. And fire will come. We all know that. This is fire country. We chose to live here, and that means choosing to adapt or choosing to lose everything over and over. She looked at Tom, at Linda, at all the others who had trusted her enough to build differently. You've all heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. This isn't new. This isn't innovative. This is ancient. We're not inventing anything. We're just remembering what our ancestors knew, that the earth protects itself, if you let it, that thermal mass and moisture content matter more than modern materials, that sometimes the old ways survive for a reason. Maya pulled out her grandmother's journal, held it up. This journal represents 300 years of knowledge from a village in the Sierra Madre, knowledge that came north with my grandmother and almost died with her, knowledge that would have been lost if fire hadn't forced me to look for answers in places I had been taught to dismiss. She paused, throat tight with emotion she hadn't expected. My grandmother used to say, Los montañas guardan lo que les damos. The mountains keep what we give them. She was talking about buildings, but also about knowledge, about traditions, about the wisdom of knowing how to live in a place rather than just occupying it. We gave these mountains conventional houses, and they burned, but we're giving them something different now. Something that works with fire instead of pretending fire doesn't exist. And maybe, if we're lucky, we're giving our children and grandchildren knowledge that will keep them safe long after we're gone. She closed the journal. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Thank you for being willing to build differently. The gathering dispersed slowly, people stopping to look at Maya's cabin, to touch the living roof, to ask last questions about construction details they were still figuring out. Maya answered them patiently, the way her grandmother would have, the way knowledge was meant to be shared. As the sun set behind the western ridge, painting the sky orange and red, colors that would always carry double meaning in fire country, Tom Brennan approached with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Thought you might need this," he said. Maya accepted the glass gratefully. They sat on her porch steps, watching the light fade, comfortable in silence. "You know what the strangest thing is?" Tom said eventually. "All these years living here, I never once thought about how we built. It was just how you did it. You bought a kit from the lumber yard. You put it up, you moved in. Never occurred to me that there might be better ways." "Why would it?" Maya said, "That's what everyone did. That's what we were taught. Still feel stupid about it. Don't. Feel grateful we got a chance to learn." She sipped her wine, felt the warmth spread through her chest. "My parents didn't get that chance. A lot of people didn't." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. Life returned to the burned landscape, persistent and resilient, the way life always was. "Your grandmother will be proud," Tom said quietly, "of what you've done here, what you've taught us." Maya thought about Abuela Rosa, about the journal and the stories and the knowledge carried from one country to another, from one generation to the next, about the cabin standing solid behind her, proof that the old woman's memories were more than nostalgia. "I hope so," she said. "I really hope so." 3 years after the Cascade Fire, the California Office of the State Fire Marshal released new guidelines for alternative roofing systems in wildland-urban interface zones. The guidelines, heavily influenced by Dr. Reeves' research and the documented performance of Maya's cabin, created a pathway for living roofs to receive building permits without requiring expensive variance proceedings. 5 years after the fire, over 200 homes in Northern California had been built or retrofitted with living roof systems. The number was growing annually as more people saw the evidence, read the studies, attended the workshops. 7 years after the fire, Maya stood on a hillside above Pine Ridge, watching smoke rise from controlled burn in the valley below. The Forestry Service was clearing undergrowth again, managing fuel loads, trying to prevent the next big fire before it started. But everyone knew the next fire would come eventually. That was the reality of living in this landscape, in this climate, in this century of changing weather patterns and extended droughts. The difference was that now, when it came, more people would be ready, more homes would stand, more families would survive. Maya's cabin was 10 years old now. The living roof was in its 3rd generation of grass, replanted twice as part of normal maintenance. The straw bale walls were settling nicely, developing the kind of character that only came with age. The structure had weathered a decade of summers and winters, of rain and drought, of small fires that came close, but never close enough to test the system again. She hoped it would never be tested that way again. But if it was, she knew it would stand, because the earth protected itself, because thermal mass and moisture content mattered, because her grandmother's knowledge, carried from a village in the mountains of Mexico, had proven true in the mountains of California, because sometimes the old way survived for a reason, and now that knowledge was surviving, spreading, protecting people the way it was always meant to. Maya turned from the hillside and walked back to her cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. She still burned wood in winter, but far less than her neighbors with conventional construction. The grass on her roof rippled in the breeze, green and alive, a meadow growing against the sky. She had work to do. Another workshop next weekend. A consultation with an architect in Oregon. Emails from homeowners asking questions about soil mixtures and plant selection, and whether this would really work in their climate. The answer was yes if they listened, if they were willing to build differently, if they trusted knowledge that had been tested not in laboratories but in centuries of human experience. Maya opened her door, felt the familiar comfort of thick walls and regulated temperature, of a home that was more than just shelter. It was proof. It was promise. It was her grandmother's voice saying across the years that the mountains kept what you gave them, and what Maya had given was love and labor and knowledge that refused to die. The cabin stood, and it would keep standing. That was enough. 10 years after the Cascade Fire, Maya Castellanos received a letter that would change everything again. It came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, delivered by the postal carrier, who still made the climb up to Pine Ridge twice a week. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with a return address from the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. Maya opened it standing on her porch, her coffee growing cold in her other hand as she read, "Dear Ms. Castellanos, we are writing to inform you that you have been selected as a recipient of the 2028 National Medal for Innovation in Sustainable Architecture. This honor recognizes your pioneering work in fire-resilient building techniques and your efforts to preserve and disseminate traditional ecological knowledge. The ceremony will be held at the Department of the Interior on September 15th. We hope you will be able to attend." Maya read the letter 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding something. A national medal, for doing what her grandmother had taught her, for building a cabin that survived when it should have burned. She sat down heavily on the porch steps, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Rosa Sanchez found her there an hour later, still holding the letter, staring at the mountains like they might offer an explanation for something that made no sense. "Maya, you okay?" Rosa climbed out of her truck, concerned by the expression on Maya's face. Maya handed her the letter without speaking. Rosa read it, and her face transformed. "Oh my God! Maya, do you understand what this means?" "It means they won't give me a medal for my grandmother's work," Maya said quietly. "It means they're recognizing that what you've done matters," Rosa corrected. "That you've changed how people think about building in fire zones. That you've saved lives." Maya shook her head. "I just built a cabin. That's all. I just wanted to survive." "You did a lot more than that." Rosa sat beside her on the steps. "You've trained over 3,000 people in the past 10 years. You've influenced building codes in 6 states. There are 473 homes standing right now that wouldn't exist without you, homes that will protect families for generations." The number surprised Maya. She knew they kept statistics at the center, but she tried not to think about them. Numbers felt too abstract. Each home was a family, a story, a choice someone made to build differently because she had shown them it was possible. "My grandmother should be getting this medal," Maya said. "Not me." "Your grandmother isn't here," Rosa said gently. "You are, and you're the one who proved her knowledge could work in the modern world. You're the one who stood in front of code enforcement boards and insurance companies and neighbors who thought you were crazy. You're the one who stayed when everyone else evacuated." Maya looked at her cabin, at the living roof now in full spring glory, covered in wildflowers that the native grasses supported, purple lupin and golden poppies, and white yarrow mixing with the blue grama and fescue. A meadow suspended against the sky, exactly as her grandmother had promised it could be. "I don't want to go to Washington," Maya said. "I don't want to make speeches or shake hands with politicians. I just want to keep doing the work." "Then do both," Rosa said. "Accept the medal. Tell your grandmother's story. And come home and keep doing the work. But don't pretend this doesn't matter, because it does." The ceremony was scheduled for September, which gave Maya 4 months to dread it. She threw herself into work instead, trying not to think about speeches or medals or the kind of attention she had spent most of her life avoiding. The Pine Ridge Center for Fire-Resilient Building was expanding. They had outgrown the original demonstration building and were constructing a new facility that would house a research library, expanded workshop space, and overnight accommodations for students who traveled long distances for training. The new building pushed the techniques even further. They were experimenting with rammed earth walls, compressed soil stabilized with just enough cement to create structures that were essentially fireproof. The roof will be the largest living roof in California, 8,000 square feet of native plants, with multiple microclimates to demonstrate different approaches to the same principle. Maya spent her days on construction site, working alongside volunteers and students, teaching through doing the way her grandmother had taught her. She was happiest with tools in her hands, with soil under her fingernails, with the physical proof of knowledge becoming structure. But the letter sat on her desk, and September kept getting closer. In July, a film crew arrived from PBS. They were producing a documentary about climate adaptation and wanted to feature Maya's work. She tried to refuse, but Rosa pointed out that the publicity would help the center, would reach people they couldn't reach through workshops alone. So Maya let them film. Cameras followed her through a typical day, tending her roof garden, consulting on a new home design, teaching a workshop on straw bale construction. They interviewed her neighbors, her students, Dr. Reeves from Berkeley, and the fire chief who had responded to the Cascade Fire and remembered finding Maya's cabin standing alone in a landscape of ash. "I thought she was dead," Chief Anderson said to the camera. "I thought anyone who stayed through that fire was gone. Then I saw smoke from her chimney. She was making coffee. Just making coffee like it was a normal morning. And her cabin was fine. Everything around her was destroyed, but her cabin was fine." The interviewer asked Maya about that morning, about what it felt like to survive when so many others hadn't. Guilt mostly, Maya said honestly. Survivor's guilt. Relief. Vindication that felt wrong to feel when people had died. Gratitude to my grandmother for teaching me what she knew. All of it at once. "Do you think your parents will be proud of what you've done?" Maya had a pause, throat tight with emotion that still came unexpectedly even after 10 years. "I think they'd be glad that their deaths led to something that saves lives. That's not the same as being worth it. Nothing makes it worth it, but it's something." The documentary would air in November, they told her, after the medal ceremony, after whatever came next. In August, Maya received another letter. This one was handwritten. On paper that had been folded and unfolded many times. The postmark was from Oaxaca, Mexico. "Estimada Maya, my name is Carmen Castellanos. I am your grandmother's niece, her brother's daughter. I am writing because I saw an article online about your work, about the cabin you built using techniques from our village. I must tell you something important. Your grandmother's knowledge did not come only from our village. She was trained by her own grandmother, who was trained by her grandmother before her. This knowledge goes back 7 generations in our family, maybe more. We are the keepers of this knowledge. But I am the last one here who remembers. My children moved to the city. They think the old ways are backward. I am 73 now, and when I die, the knowledge dies with me, unless you help me preserve it. I have journals, sketches, techniques for building that your grandmother never saw because she left before her training was complete. Methods for earthquake resistance, for flood protection, for building in ways that work with the earth instead of against it. I am too old to travel to California, but if you could come here, I could teach you what remains, before it is lost forever. Your cousin, Carmen." Maya sat with the letter for a long time, reading it over and over. 7 generations. Knowledge that went back nearly 200 years, maybe more. And it was dying because no one thought it mattered anymore. She showed the letter to Rosa that evening. They sat in Maya's cabin, drinking tea, watching the summer light fade over the scarred but healing mountains. "You have to go," Rosa said immediately. "This is exactly what the center was created for. Preserving traditional knowledge, documenting it before it's lost. I can't just leave. The medal ceremony is one day," Rosa interrupted. "This is a lifetime of knowledge. More than a lifetime. Go to Mexico. Learn everything Carmen can teach you. Then come back and accept your medal knowing that you've honored your grandmother by continuing what she started. The new building will be here when you get back. Maya." Rosa took her hands. "You spent 10 years teaching what your grandmother taught you. Now you have a chance to learn the rest. Don't let it slip away because you're afraid of taking time for yourself." Maya knew Rosa was right, but the thought of leaving, of traveling to Mexico alone, of meeting families she'd never known existed, felt overwhelming in ways she couldn't articulate. "I don't speak Spanish well enough," she said. "Not for technical discussions. So bring a translator. Or learn, or muddle through with hand gestures and drawings." You figured out how to build a living roof from sketches in a journal. You can figure this out, too. Maya flew to Oaxaca in late August, carrying a duffel bag with her grandmother's journal, a camera, recording equipment, and enough notebooks to document everything Carmen might teach her. The village was smaller than she had imagined. Perched on a hillside in the Sierra Madre where the air was thin and sweet, and every breath tasted like pine and would smoke. The houses were exactly as her grandmother had described them. Thick earthen walls, living roofs covered in native grasses, positioned to work with the slope rather than against it. Carmen met her at the edge of the village, a tiny woman with weathered skin and eyes that reminded Maya painfully of her grandmother. They embraced like the family they were, separated by borders and decades, but connected by knowledge that had survived both. Bienvenida a casa, Carmen said. Welcome home. For the next 3 weeks, Maya learned. Carmen spoke limited English. Maya spoke broken Spanish. But knowledge had its own language. They communicated through drawings and demonstrations, through building together and modifying techniques until Maya understood not just the what, but the why. Carmen showed her earthquake-resistant foundation techniques that distributed stress through the entire structure instead of concentrating it at connection points. Flood-proof designs that use water's weight and movement to strengthen rather than undermine. Ways of reading the land to determine the best building sites, the best orientations, the best materials for specific conditions. The earth tells you what it needs, Carmen said through translator Maya had hired from the nearest town. You just have to listen. Your grandmother understood this. She tried to teach your grandfather, but he was too American by then. He wanted concrete and steel. He wanted to fight the earth instead of working with it. She taught me, Maya said, everything in her journal. I built my cabin exactly the way she described. Carmen smiled. That journal was just the beginning. She left before I could teach her everything our grandmother taught me. But now I teach you, and you will teach others. The knowledge continues. They worked from dawn until dusk, documenting everything. Maya filled 7 notebooks with sketches and measurements and principles. She took hundreds of photographs. She recorded hours of video showing Carmen demonstrating techniques that had been perfected over generations. On the last day, Carmen took Maya to a small cemetery on the hillside above the village. She stopped at a grave marked with a simple stone cross and a name. Maya recognized Rosa Castellanos' grandmother, her great-great-grandmother, the woman who had started this lineage of knowledge. She built 43 houses in this village, Carmen said. Every one still standing. Some are over 150 years old. They survived earthquakes that destroyed everything else. They survived floods and fires and the kind of storms that remake landscapes. They survived because she understood what the earth needed. Carmen placed her hand on the stone. She told me once that buildings should outlive the people who make them. That knowledge should outlive the people who hold it. That we are just temporary keepers of wisdom that belongs to everyone who comes after. Maya knelt beside the grave, touched the stone that marked her ancestors' resting place. She thought about her grandmother, about her parents, about all the people who had been lost to fire because they had built with materials that looked modern but failed when it mattered most. I'll keep it alive, Maya said, not a promise to Carmen, but to the woman buried beneath the stone. To all the women who had carried this knowledge forward through generations. I'll make sure it doesn't die. Maya returned to California in mid-September, 2 days before the medal ceremony. She was exhausted from travel and overwhelmed by everything she had learned, but she felt something else too, a sense of completion, of connection to something larger than herself. Rosa picked her up at the airport, took one look at her face, and said, "It changed you. It gave me context." Maya said, "I thought I was just building a cabin, but I'm part of something that's been going on for 200 years, maybe longer. I'm just one link in a chain. An important link," Rosa pointed out, "the link that's keeping the chain from breaking." They drove straight to the new center building. It was nearly complete now. The walls finished, the roof partially planted, the interior space taking shape. It was beautiful in the way functional things were beautiful, in the way buildings were beautiful when they served their purpose perfectly. "We added something while you were gone," Rosa said, leading Maya to the entrance. Above the door was a carved wooden sign with 3 names: Rosa Castellanos, Carmen Castellanos, Maya Castellanos. "It's not just your center," Rosa said quietly. "It's theirs too. We couldn't do any of this without the knowledge they preserved." Maya stood looking at the sign for a long time, thinking about her grandmother, about Carmen and her village in Mexico, about the great-great-grandmother buried on the hillside, about all the women whose names she would never know who had carried this knowledge forward through fire and flood and earthquake and time. "Thank you," she said finally, "for understanding." "Come on," Rosa said. "We need to get you ready for Washington. You're accepting a medal in 2 days, and you look like you've been living in the mountains of Mexico." I have been living in the mountains of Mexico. Exactly my point. The ceremony at the Department of the Interior was more formal than Maya had imagined. She wore a dress Rosa had helped her pick out, stood in a room full of people she didn't know, and tried not to feel like an imposter. When they called her name, she walked to the podium where the Secretary of the Interior waited with a medal on a blue ribbon. The citation was read aloud. Something about innovation and traditional knowledge and resilience in the face of climate change. Maya barely heard it. She was thinking about her grandmother's hands, weathered and strong, sketching roof designs by lantern light. The secretary shook her hand, placed a medal around her neck, and stepped back for photographs. Then it was Maya's turn to speak. She had prepared remarks. Rosa had helped her write something appropriate, something professional. But standing there with the weight of the medal against her chest and the faces of strangers watching her, she set the prepared speech aside. "My grandmother, Rosa Castellanos, immigrated to California in 1962, Maya began. She came from a village in the Sierra Madre of Mexico where houses were built from earth and grass and stone, where people had been building the same way for generations because it worked, because the earth protected itself if you let it." She pulled her grandmother's journal from her bag, held it up. "This journal contains knowledge that saved my life, that saved my home when fire came through and destroyed everything around it, that has now saved hundreds of other homes and will save hundreds more. But this isn't my knowledge. I didn't invent anything. I didn't discover anything. I just listened to my grandmother. I just trusted that maybe the old way survived for a reason." She looked around the room at the architects and officials and academics who had come for the ceremony. "We treat traditional knowledge like it's quaint, like it's folk wisdom that's been superseded by modern engineering. But my grandmother's village has buildings that are over 150 years old, buildings that have survived everything the earth could throw at them. How many modern buildings will last that long?" I just returned from Mexico, where I spent 3 weeks with my cousin Carmen, learning techniques that go back 7 generations, learning that what I thought I knew was just the beginning, learning that there's an entire body of knowledge out there that's dying because we decided it doesn't matter. She held up the medal. "This honor means a great deal to me, but I'm accepting it on behalf of my grandmother Rosa and her grandmother before her, and my cousin Carmen, who is 73 years old, and teaching anyone who will listen before the knowledge dies with her. I'm accepting it on behalf of everyone who has preserved traditional ecological knowledge, even when the world told them it was worthless. Because it's not worthless. It's essential. And if we're going to survive the climate crisis, if we're going to adapt to a world of more fires and more floods and more extreme weather, we need to stop treating indigenous and traditional knowledge like it's a curiosity and start treating it like the survival manual it actually is." Maya paused, feeling tears prickle behind her eyes. "My parents died in a fire. They died because the way we build in this country prioritizes profit over protection, speed over survival, modern materials over techniques that have been tested by centuries of human experience. Every home that burns with people inside is a failure of imagination, a failure to ask whether maybe, just maybe, there's a better way to build, a way that doesn't make shareholders rich but keeps families alive." She looked down at the journal in her hands. "This journal is going to be digitized and made freely available online. Every sketch, every note, every principle my grandmother documented, and the knowledge I learned from Carmen will be added to it. And the techniques we develop at the Pine Ridge Center will be added to it. All of it open source, all of it free, all of it available to anyone who wants to build differently. Because knowledge this important doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone. And if this metal helps spread that knowledge, if it helps convince one more family to build with earth instead of petroleum, if it saves one more life, then it will have been worth accepting. She looked at the secretary. Thank you for this honor. I'll try to live up to it by making sure my grandmother's knowledge survives long enough to protect people she'll never meet, in places she never traveled, for generations she'll never see. That's the best legacy I can think of. Not a medal, but knowledge that lives on. The speech went viral. Not in the usual way. No millions of views overnight, but it spread through the networks that mattered. Architecture schools added it to their curricula. Environmental organizations shared it. Climate activists quoted it. Traditional knowledge keepers from around the world reached out to say thank you for saying what they had been trying to say for years. Maya returned to Pine Ridge exhausted but determined. The tension was overwhelming, but it was also opportunity. She spent the fall traveling to universities and conferences, not to receive more awards but to teach, to show slides of her cabin in Carmen's village, to demonstrate that traditional knowledge wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated, tested, proven by the only metric that mattered, survival. In November, the PBS documentary aired. It showed Maya's journey from tragedy to survival to teaching, from building one cabin to starting a movement. The final scene was filmed at the New Center building, where a class of 40 students from 6 different states were learning to mix lime plaster and stack straw bales. We're not just building homes, Maya said to the camera. We're building a different relationship with fire, with climate, with the earth itself. And we're doing it by remembering what we almost forgot. The documentary won a Peabody Award. The center received grant funding from 3 major foundations. Applications for workshops tripled, and Maya found herself doing something she had never imagined, teaching a new generation of builders that the future of sustainable architecture looked a lot like the past. 15 years after the Cascade Fire, Maya stood on a hillside above Pine Ridge, looking at a community transformed. Where once there had been conventional construction, composition roofs and vinyl siding and all the materials that burned so easily, now there were living roofs and earthen walls in buildings designed to survive. Tom Brennan's house had weathered 3 close calls with wildfire in 15 years. Not a single ember had penetrated his living roof. Linda Mercer's home, rebuilt after the Cascade Fire, had become a teaching site for the center, hosting tours that showed what was possible. And scattered throughout Northern California, across 6 states now, were homes built using her grandmother's principles. Each one a small fortress against fire. Each one a testament to knowledge that almost died. Maya was 51 now. Her hair was starting to gray. Her hands showed the wear of decades of physical labor. But she felt stronger than she had at 30. More grounded. More certain of her purpose. Carmen had died the previous winter, peacefully in her sleep at age 78. But before she died, she had seen the digitized library of traditional knowledge go live online. She had seen her village's techniques being taught to architects around the world. She had known that the knowledge would survive her. The chain continues, she had written to Maya in her last letter. You are teaching my great-grandchildren things I never could. The knowledge is spreading further than I dreamed possible. I can rest now. Maya kept that letter on her desk, next to her grandmother's journal and the medal she rarely looked at but couldn't bring herself to put away. The Pine Ridge Center had graduated over 5,000 students now. They had documented traditional building techniques from 17 different cultures. They had influenced building codes in 9 states. They had created a network of builders and architects and engineers who understood that working with the earth was smarter than fighting it. But the work was far from finished. Climate change was accelerating. Fire seasons were lengthening. More communities faced the choice of adapting or abandoning land that had been inhabited for generations. Maya thought about this as she walked back to her cabin, the first cabin, the one that had started everything. It was 20 years old now, showing its age in good ways. The walls had settled and hardened. The roof had been replanted twice and now supported a fully mature ecosystem. Not just grass, but wildflowers and sage, and even a few small shrubs that had seeded themselves. She climbed onto the roof, something she did less frequently now, but still regularly enough to stay connected to the structure that had saved her life. The view from up here never got old. Mountains to the east, valley to the west, the healing scars of old fires visible everywhere she looked. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rosa. New student wants to build in New Mexico. Says she heard your grandmother's story and it changed everything. Can you talk to her? Maya smiled and texted back. Send her my number. There would always be another student, another family who needed to build differently, another community facing fire and looking for solutions that went beyond evacuation plans and insurance policies. And Maya would keep teaching, keep spreading her grandmother's knowledge, keep adding to it with what Carmen had taught her, with what students discovered, with what the earth revealed to anyone patient enough to listen. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and red and gold. Fire colors, danger colors, but also the colors of survival, of sunset, of another day ended with her cabin still standing and knowledge still spreading. Maya sat on her living roof, felt the give of the soil beneath her, the resilience of the roots that held everything together. She thought about her grandmother, about Carmen, about the great-great-grandmother buried in Mexico whose building still stood after a century and a half. She thought about all the women whose names she would never know who had carried this knowledge forward, who had believed it mattered even when the world told them it didn't. And she made a promise to all of them, the same promise she had made 15 years ago at a gravestone in the Sierra Madre. I'll keep it alive. I'll make sure it doesn't die. The chain continues. The knowledge survives. The buildings stand. And somewhere in villages and cities and mountains all over the world, people are learning that the earth protects itself if you let it, that sometimes the old ways are the only ways at work. That survival is built on knowledge passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation, from grandmother to granddaughter and beyond. Maya stood, brushed soil from her jeans, and climbed down from the roof. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But tonight, she would rest. She would make dinner in her fireproof kitchen, sleep in her temperature-regulated bedroom, and wake tomorrow to teach another group of students that building differently was possible. That survival was a choice we made with every structure we raised. That the earth would keep what we gave it for as long as we remembered how to give properly. Her grandmother had given her that knowledge. She was giving it to the world. The fire would come again. It always did. But when it came, more people would be ready. More homes would stand. More families would survive, and that, Maya thought as she closed her door against the gathering darkness, was worth every medal, every speech, every moment of doubt and fear and grief that had brought her to this place. The cabin stood, the knowledge lived, and tomorrow she would teach again. The girl couldn't have been more than 9 years old. She stood at the edge of Maya's property with her mother, both of them looking up at the cabin with expressions Maya had learned to recognize over the decades. Wonder mixed with skepticism, hope tempered by fear. Is it true, the girl asked, her voice small but determined, that your house can't burn? Maya was 66 now, her hair silver gray, her face weathered by sun and smoke, and a quarter-century of living in fire country. She set down the watering can she'd been using to tend the herb garden that now grew alongside her cabin, and walked over to meet them. Nothing can't burn, Maya said gently, kneeling to meet the girl at eye level. But this cabin is built to resist fire, to survive it, which is different. Our house burned, the girl said, matter of fact in the way children could be about trauma when it was too big to fully process. Last summer, everything burned. I'm sorry, Maya said, and meant it. 25 years of teaching fire-resilient building hadn't made the losses any easier to bear. Every family that came to her had lost something, a home, a loved one, the illusion that they were safe. The mother spoke for the first time. We're rebuilding. The insurance company recommended conventional construction, but she gestured helplessly at the cabin. My sister took your workshop 3 years ago. She said we should talk to you before we made any decisions. What's your name? Maya asked the girl. Rosa, the girl said, and Maya felt her heart catch. Of course it was. The name kept returning, generation after generation, like knowledge that refused to die. That's my grandmother's name, Maya said. She taught me everything I know about building homes that survive. Young Rosa's eyes widened. Really? Really? Come on, I'll show you. Maya walked them through the cabin, explaining as she had explained to thousands of students over the years. But she had learned to tailor the tour to her audience, and a 9-year-old needed different language than an architect or engineer. See these walls? Maya pressed her palm against the lime plaster. They're made of straw and earth, but they're not weak. Fire tried to get through them and couldn't. Feel how thick they are. Rosa pressed her small hand against the wall, eyes widening. It's cold. Thermal mass, Maya explained. The walls stay cool in summer, warm in winter. They breathe, but they don't burn. Your house probably had thin walls, with frame with siding. Rosa's mother nodded. Standard construction. It went up in minutes once the fire reached it. These walls would have bought you hours, Maya said. Maybe long enough for the fire crews to save it. Definitely long enough for everyone to get out safely. They climbed the ladder to the roof. It was late spring, and the living roof was at its peak glory. A riot of wildflowers and native grasses, purple and gold and green stretching across the entire structure. Young Rosa gasped. It's a garden, on your roof. It's protection, Maya said. But yes, it's beautiful too. Those aren't just pretty flowers. Every single plant up here is native to these mountains. They evolved to survive drought and fire. Their roots go deep into the soil, 8 inches of it, and that soil stays damp even in the middle of summer. Why? Rosa asked. Because I water it, and because the roots hold moisture like a sponge. When fire comes, and fire always comes to these mountains, this wet earth acts like armor. The flames can't reach the wood underneath because the soil protects it. Maya knelt down, dug her fingers into the growing medium, pulled up a handful to show the girl. Feel this. Smell it. This is what saved my life 25 years ago. Earth and water and roots all working together. Rosa took the soil carefully, held it to her nose. It smells like after rain. Exactly. And fire hates rain. The girl's mother was crying quietly, trying to hide it, but not quite managing. Maya pretended not to notice, gave her time to collect herself. Can we build a roof like this? Rosa asked. On our new house? You can, Maya said. Your mom will need to learn how, or hire someone who knows. But yes, you absolutely can. Will you teach us? The girl asked with the directness of childhood. Please. Maya looked at the mother, saw the hope and desperation warring in her expression, saw another family at a crossroads, choosing between rebuilding the same way and trying something different. Yes, Maya said, I'll teach you. The workshop ran for 3 weekends in June. Rosa and her mother came to all 6 sessions, along with 17 other families rebuilding after the previous summer's fires. The fires were worse now, had been getting worse every year. Longer seasons, higher temperatures, faster-moving flames. The new normal that everyone talked about but few people truly adapted to. Maya had stopped trying to convince people through words years ago. Now she let the buildings speak for themselves. The Pine Ridge Center complex had expanded to 7 structures, all demonstrating different techniques. Straw bale, rammed earth, adobe, living roofs, green walls, passive cooling systems. Every building a teaching tool. Every structure proof that ancient knowledge still worked in the modern world. On the final day of the workshop, after they had built a small demonstration structure from start to finish, walls raised, roof planted, systems installed, Maya gathered the families in a circle. You've learned the techniques, she said. How to mix plaster, how to stack bales, how to size irrigation systems. But I want to talk about something more important. I want to talk about why this matters. She pulled out her grandmother's journal. It was protected now in an archival sleeve. The original page is too fragile for regular handling. But she had made copies, hundreds of them, distributed to every student who passed through the center. This journal is 90 years old, Maya said. The woman who wrote it came to California from Mexico, carrying knowledge that was already ancient when she learned it. Knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter for 7 generations. Maybe more, we'll never know exactly how far back it goes. She opened to a page showing her grandmother's sketch of a living roof, the measurements carefully noted in faded ink. When I built my cabin, I built it from these sketches. I had never seen a living roof in person. I just trusted that my grandmother knew what she was talking about, that the old ways had survived for a reason. Maya looked around the circle, met each person's eyes. You're here because you lost something. A home, safety, the belief that you were protected. I know that pain. I lived it. My parents died in a fire because they built the way everyone said to build. Young Rosa's hand slipped into her mother's. Maya saw it and continued, more gently. But loss can teach us. My loss taught me to listen to my grandmother, to trust knowledge that the modern world had dismissed. And that choice saved my life when fire came. She held up the journal. This isn't just paper and ink. This is survival information. This is 7 generations of women figuring out how to live in places where fire and earthquake and flood were constant threats. 7 generations of not giving up, not running away, but learning how to build better. You're going to take what you learned here and build homes for your families. Some of you will follow these techniques exactly. Some will adapt them. All of that is fine. But I want you to understand that you're part of something bigger than just construction. You're part of a chain of knowledge that goes back centuries. And when you build your homes, when you teach your children why you built them this way, you're making sure that chain doesn't break. The mother of young Rosa raised her hand tentatively. What happens to all this knowledge when you're not here anymore? It was a question Maya got often now. She was 66, still healthy, still strong, but no one lived forever. The question of succession had become urgent. The knowledge is already spreading, Maya said. We've digitized everything. My grandmother's journal, my cousin Carmen's techniques, everything we developed here at the center. It's all freely available online. We've trained over 8,000 people in 25 years. Those people are teaching others. The knowledge is alive and growing. She paused and smiled. But I'm also training specific people to continue the work when I can't. My apprentices, the next generation of seed keepers. Seed keepers, someone asked. That's what Carmen called us, Maya said. The women who kept this knowledge alive. We're seed keepers. We hold the seeds of knowledge through the winter, and we plant them again in the spring. The seeds grow, produce more seeds, spread further than we could ever carry them ourselves. That's what you're all becoming. Seed keepers, knowledge carriers, people who understand that survival isn't about fighting the earth. It's about working with it. After the workshop ended, after the families had left with their plans and their newfound confidence, Maya found young Rosa and her mother still standing by the demonstration structure they had built together. Can I ask you something? The mother said. Of course. Why do you do this? You could retire. You've proven everything you needed to prove. Why keep teaching? Maya was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. My grandmother gave me a gift, she said finally. She gave me knowledge that saved my life. But she didn't just give it to me. She gave it to me to pass on. That was always part of it. Knowledge this important doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone who needs it. She looked at young Rosa, saw the girl running her hand along the freshly plastered wall of their demonstration building. I keep teaching because every time I teach, I honor my grandmother. I honor Carmen. I honor all the women whose names I'll never know who kept this knowledge alive through wars and famines and migrations. They did the hard work. I'm just trying to make sure it wasn't for nothing. Plus, Maya added with a slight smile, I'm selfish. Every home built this way is one more family that won't go through what I went through. One more little girl who won't lose her parents the way I lost mine. That's not altruism. That's survival. We survive together or we don't survive at all. Rosa's mother wiped her eyes. Thank you for teaching us, for giving us hope that we can rebuild without being terrified every fire season. Build it right, Maya said. Teach Rosa why you built it that way. And someday, when she's grown and built her own home, she'll remember. The knowledge will continue. That's all I ask. That evening, Maya sat on her porch as the sun set behind the western ridge. The mountains were scarred by fire. They always were now, every year bringing new burns, new losses. But they were also healing. Green was returning to old burns. Trees were slowly reestablishing. Life persisted. Her phone rang. Rosa Sanchez, the other Rosa, her partner in building the center from a single cabin into a movement. "Did you see the email from Scotland?" Rosa asked without preamble. "Not yet." "What's happening in Scotland?" "They want to start a European branch of the center. They've been following our work, and they want to adapt the techniques for their climate. Traditional knowledge integration with modern fire-resilient design." Maya leaned back in her chair. "Processing." "Scotland. Seriously, climate change is global. Wildfires are increasing everywhere. People are desperate for solutions at work. And our data is undeniable. 25 years of homes surviving fires that destroyed everything around them. They want what we have. What we have is my grandmother's journal and a lot of trial and error." Maya said. "What we have is proof," Rosa corrected. "Proof that traditional ecological knowledge isn't primitive. It's essential. They want to replicate that with Scottish traditional building techniques. Turf roofs, stone walls, the whole Highland cottage tradition applied to modern climate resilience." Maya thought about her grandmother, about Carmen, about the girl named Rosa who had visited today. The chain continuing. The knowledge spreading further than she had ever imagined possible. "Tell them yes," Maya said, "and tell them we'll help however we can." After she hung up, Maya opened her laptop to check her email. The Scottish proposal was there, detailed and well-researched. But below it was another email that caught her attention. It was from the National Archives. They wanted to add her grandmother's original journal to their permanent collection, to preserve it alongside other documents that had shaped American history. Maya sat with that for a long time. Her grandmother's journal, written by a Mexican immigrant in a mix of Spanish and broken English. Sketches made by candlelight in a Sacramento apartment. That journal considered historically significant, worth preserving for future generations. She thought about what her grandmother would say about that. Probably something dry and pragmatic. Good. Maybe now people will listen. Maya composed a careful reply. Yes, they could have the original journal for the archives, but only if they agreed to keep it freely accessible, digitized, and available to anyone who wanted to learn from it. No paywalls. No restricted access. Knowledge this important belonged to everyone. She hit send and closed her laptop. The night was fully dark now, stars emerging in the clear mountain air. Maya walked to her cabin, the first cabin, the one that started everything, and climbed the ladder to the roof one more time. The grass was cool beneath her hands, damp from the evening watering. The wildflowers had closed for the night, but she could smell them. Yarrow and sage and the sweet, dusty scent of native grasses. The scent of survival. She lay back on the living roof and looked up at the stars. Somewhere up there, her grandmother was watching. Her parents. Carmen. All the ancestors whose names she didn't know, but whose knowledge she carried. "I kept my promise," Maya said to the stars. "I didn't let it die." 8,000 students. Hundreds of homes standing that would have burned. Knowledge spreading to Scotland, to Australia, to fire-prone regions all over the world. Traditional techniques being validated by modern science, incorporated into building codes, taught in architecture schools. The chain had not broken. The seeds had been planted. The knowledge was growing. Maya thought about young Rosa, 9 years old with her mother's determination and her own native curiosity. That girl would build a home that survived. She would teach her own children why it mattered. And the knowledge would continue, generation after generation, for as long as people needed to know how to survive in a changing world. That was legacy, not a medal, not fame or recognition, or having your grandmother's journal in the National Archives, though those things mattered too. Legacy was knowledge that outlived you, techniques that protected people you would never meet, understanding that spread further than you could ever travel yourself. Maya had given her life to preserving her grandmother's knowledge, but she realized now lying on her living roof under a sky full of stars, that the knowledge had also given her a life worth living. It had given her purpose, community, the satisfaction of knowing that her work mattered, that it saved lives, that it would continue long after she was gone. She was 66. If she was lucky, she had another 20 years, maybe 25. She would use them the same way she had used the last 25, teaching, building, spreading the knowledge as far and wide as she could. But she wasn't worried about what came after anymore. The seed keepers were everywhere now. The knowledge was secure. The chain would hold. Fire would keep coming to these mountains. That was certain. Climate change ensured it. But when it came, more people would be ready. More homes would stand. More families would survive. Because an immigrant woman had carried knowledge from Mexico to California. Because that woman's granddaughter had listened when everyone else dismissed her as crazy. Because knowledge, once planted, grew in ways you could never predict. Maya stood slowly, her knees protesting after decades of physical labor, but still strong enough to climb down the ladder. She stood in her clearing, looking at her cabin silhouetted against the stars. 25 years since the Cascade Fire. 25 years since she had made the choice to stay when everyone else evacuated. 25 years since her cabin had survived and proved that the old ways still worked. Tomorrow she would teach another workshop. Next week she would consult on a project in Oregon. Next month she would travel to Scotland to help establish the European Center. The work continued. It always continued. But tonight she would rest. She would sleep in her fireproof cabin, under her living roof, surrounded by walls that breathed and held and protected. She would sleep knowing that she had honored her grandmother's legacy, that she had kept a promise she made standing in the ashes of her parents' home, that somewhere, right now, families were sleeping safely in homes built from knowledge that almost died but didn't. The seed keepers had done their job. The knowledge survived. And that, Maya thought as she closed her door against the mountain night, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The fire came on a Tuesday in August, carried on winds that screamed down from the high country at 60 miles per hour. It jumped the containment lines before dawn, raced through 3 valleys by noon, and reached Pine Ridge by mid-afternoon with a fury that reminded everyone who had survived the Cascade Fire why they still woke sweating from nightmares 3 decades later. Maya Castellanos was 71 years old. She stood on her porch watching the smoke column rise like a mushroom cloud over the eastern ridge, and she felt the old fear settle into her bones. Not for herself. Her cabin had survived fire before and would again, but for the community she had spent 3 decades teaching to build differently. This was a test. The real test. Not one cabin surviving while its neighbors burned, but an entire community built on principles the modern world had dismissed as primitive. 30 years of workshops and demonstrations and patient explanation about thermal mass and moisture retention and working with the earth instead of against it. 30 years that would be validated or proven worthless in the next 6 hours. Her phone was ringing constantly. Students calling from across the state, asking if she needed to evacuate, offering help, expressing fear for the homes they had built using her grandmother's techniques. Maya let most calls go to voicemail. She had work to do. She moved through her property with the efficiency of long practice, activating irrigation systems, checking defensible space, sealing vents and windows. The cabin that had seemed like an experiment 30 years ago now felt like an old friend, familiar and trustworthy. She knew every beam, every layer, every square foot of living roof that would either protect her or fail her in the hours ahead. But she wasn't just protecting her own cabin anymore. Maya climbed into her truck and drove through Pine Ridge, stopping at each of the 37 homes that had been built using her techniques over the past 3 decades. Some were occupied. Some were empty. The owners evacuated despite Maya's assurances that their homes would hold. At each one, she checked systems, activated rooftop irrigation, verified that defensible space remained clear. Tom Brennan was still there, 89 years old and stubborn as the granite these mountains were built from. He stood in his clearing watching her check his irrigation system with the same skeptical expression he'd worn 30 years ago when she first explained how a wet roof could survive fire. "You staying?" he asked. "I'm staying. Damn fool thing to do at our age. Probably, Maya agreed. You evacuating? Hell no. Built this house to stand. Time to see if you knew what you were talking about. Maya smiled despite the fear tightening her chest. Your roof's ready. Keep the irrigation running. If it gets too hot, get in your cellar and stay there. Same advice you gave yourself? Same advice I give everyone. She drove on. Linda Mercer's house. Linda had passed away 5 years ago, but her daughter lived there now with her own family. They had evacuated, but Maya checked the systems anyway. The Johnsons, the Chens, the Brennan daughters' place on the ridge. House after house built the way her grandmother had taught her to build. Each one about to face the only test that really mattered. By 4 o'clock, the fire was visible from the valley floor, a line of orange crawling over the ridgeline like the end of the world in slow motion. The sound reached her first, that freight train roar she remembered from the Cascade Fire, the sound of oxygen being consumed faster than the atmosphere could replace it. Maya drove back to her cabin, parked her truck in the clearing, and climbed onto her roof one last time before the fire arrived. The living roof was at the end of summer, the grass gone dormant and golden, the wildflowers long since gone to seed. It looked dead, looked like the kindling Tom Brennan had predicted it would become 30 years ago. But Maya knelt and pushed her fingers into the soil, felt the moisture 8 inches down where the root system still held water like a promise, and she knew the grass could burn, the soil wouldn't. She climbed down, went inside, sealed herself in her cabin, and waited. The fire reached Pine Ridge at 4:47 p.m., the same time the Cascade Fire had arrived 30 years earlier. Maya noted the coincidence and wondered if there was meaning in it or just the cruel mathematics of wind, speed, and topography. She sat in her cellar with her battery-powered radio and her grandmother's journal. The copy, the original, was in the National Archives now, and listened to the world burn above her. The sound was worse this time, louder, more violent. The wind gusted to 70 miles per hour. The heat was intense enough that she could feel it penetrating even through 8 inches of soil and the insulated cellar door. This wasn't just a fire. This was a conflagration. The radio crackled with updates. Multiple structures involved. Evacuation routes blocked. Fire crews overwhelmed. The litany of disaster that she had heard before, that everyone in fire country had heard too many times. But then something different. Engine 7 to dispatch. We're in Pine Ridge. Multiple structures with green roofs they're not burning. Repeat, structures with living roof systems are not involved. Everything else is going up, but these houses are holding. Maya's breath caught. She pressed the radio closer, listening through the static. Dispatch, can you verify? Living roofs are holding. Affirmative. We got embers raining down. We got radiant heat that should be cooking these places. But the roofs aren't catching. The soil is too wet. It's like they've got their own sprinkler systems built in. They do, Maya whispered to the darkness. They do. She listened as the reports continued. Conventional structures were failing at their usual rate. Composition roofs igniting, vinyl siding melting, homes becoming involved in minutes. But the homes built with her grandmother's techniques were standing. Not all of them. 2 had caught fire when embers found their way into defensible space that hadn't been properly maintained. But the vast majority were holding. 35 out of 37. The fire front passed in 18 minutes. 18 minutes that felt like hours, during which Maya sat in her cellar and realized that she had been right. Her grandmother had been right. Carmen had been right. All the women whose names she would never know who had developed these techniques over centuries had been right. The earth protected itself. You just had to let it. When she finally climbed out of her cellar 2 hours later, the world had become a familiar monochrome of post-fire landscape. Everything was black or gray, with a dull red of still glowing embers. The air was thick with smoke and ash. The temperature was still dangerously high, but her cabin stood, and beyond it, across the valley, she could see other structures still standing. The Brennan house, the Chun place, the cluster of homes on the East Ridge that young families had built 5 years ago after taking her workshop. Maya walked through the scorched landscape to Tom Brennan's house. He was sitting on his porch, covered in ash, drinking water from a jug and looking at his home with an expression Maya couldn't quite read. "You were right," he said when he saw her. 30 years ago, you were right, and I was wrong. You built the house," Maya said. "You trusted the techniques. That's all that matters. My neighbors didn't." Tom gestured to the east, where conventional homes had been reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The Pattersons, the Williams family, they rebuilt after the Cascade Fire with the same goddamn materials. And now, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. They both knew what happened to houses that fought fire instead of working with it. Maya spent the next hours walking through Pine Ridge, documenting what had survived and what hadn't. Of the 63 homes in the community, 37 had been built using her techniques. 35 of those 37 were standing, damaged but intact. Of the 26 conventional structures, only 4 had survived, and those only because they happened to be positioned where the fire moved past quickly. The data was undeniable. The results were stark. Traditional techniques with modern refinements had outperformed conventional construction by a factor of nearly 9 to 1. By morning, the news crews had arrived. By afternoon, the story was national. By evening, it was international. The community that survived fire by building like their ancestors. Ancient techniques proved superior to modern materials in California wildfire. Grandmother's wisdom saves lives 30 years later. Maya gave interviews until her voice was hoarse, explaining over and over that this wasn't her innovation, wasn't even new information. It was knowledge that had existed for centuries, that had almost been lost, that had survived only because a Mexican immigrant had carried it north in her memory and passed it to her granddaughter. "The question isn't why these houses survived," Maya told a reporter from the New York Times. "The question is why we ever stopped building this way, why we decided petroleum products were better than Earth, why we prioritized profit margins over human lives." The reporter asked if she was angry. "I'm tired," Maya said. "I've spent 30 years trying to teach people that there's a better way. And every time fire comes, I have to watch some people survive because they listened and some people die because they didn't. Yes, I'm angry. I'm angry that it takes disaster to make people pay attention. I'm angry that we lost ancient knowledge because we thought we were smarter than our ancestors. I'm angry that my parents died in a fire that would have been survivable if they had built differently." She paused, collecting herself. "But I'm also hopeful, because every fire, as terrible as it is, convinces more people. Every house that stands while its neighbors burn is proof that the old ways work. We're remembering. Slowly. Too slowly. But we're remembering." The Pine Ridge Fire, as it came to be called, burned for 9 days and consumed 68,000 acres. It destroyed 234 structures and killed 7 people. But in Pine Ridge itself, where 30 years of patient teaching had transformed how an entire community built, the survival rate was unprecedented. The data convinced what Maya's words never could. Building codes began to change, not just in California, but across the western United States. Insurance companies started offering premium reductions for homes built with living roofs and earthen walls. Architecture schools added traditional ecological knowledge to their curricula. FEMA updated their wildfire mitigation guidelines to include techniques that Maya's grandmother had been using in 1950. But for Maya, the most meaningful change came quietly, in small moments that added up to transformation. Young Rosa, not so young anymore at 34, had become one of Maya's primary apprentices. The girl who had visited Maya's cabin at age 9 with her mother, who had watched with wonder as Maya explained how earth and water and roots work together, had grown into a woman who taught those same principles to others. Rosa came to visit 3 weeks after the Pine Ridge Fire, bringing her own daughter, 8 years old, bright-eyed, named Carmen after Maya's cousin who preserved the knowledge in Mexico. "I want to show her," Rosa said, "the way you showed me, so she understands why we build the way we do." Maya walked young Carmen through the cabin exactly as she had walked her mother through it 25 years earlier. The same tour, the same explanations, the thick walls that breathed but didn't burn, the living roof that looked dead but held life and moisture in its root systems, the principles that saved lives for centuries and would continue saving lives for centuries more. My abuela built our house this way. Young Carmen said, using the Spanish word for grandmother without self-consciousness. After the fire that killed my great-grandparents, she said she wouldn't let fire take us the way it took them. Maya felt tears prickle behind her eyes. The chain continuing, the knowledge spreading from generation to generation, each one adding their own understanding while preserving the core wisdom. Your abuela learned from me, Maya said, but I learned from my grandmother, and she learned from her grandmother, and on, back further than we can count. You're part of that chain now. You and every other child whose parents chose to build differently. Will you teach me? Carmen asked, the way you taught my mom? Yes, Maya said. I'll teach you everything I know. That evening, after Rose and Carmen had left, Maya sat on her porch with her laptop, reviewing the flood of emails that had come in since the Pine Ridge fire. Requests for workshops had tripled. Architecture firms wanted consultations. Universities wanted her to lecture. The Scottish branch of the center wanted her to visit, to see how they had adapted her grandmother's techniques to highland conditions. She was 71 years old. She was tired. Her knees ached from 3 decades of climbing ladders and kneeling on roofs. Her hands showed the wear of physical labor. She had earned the right to rest. But the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Climate change ensured that. Fire seasons would keep lengthening. More communities would face the choice of adapting or abandoning land that had been inhabited for generations. And more people needed to know what her grandmother had known, what Carmen had preserved, what Maya had spent her life proving could save lives. She opened a new email and began to type, to the next generation of seed keepers. I am 71 years old. I have spent 30 years teaching traditional fire-resilient building techniques, and I will continue teaching for as long as I'm able. But I'm writing this because I need you to understand something important. This knowledge doesn't belong to me. It never did. It belongs to everyone who needs it, to every family building in fire country, to every community trying to adapt to a changing climate, to every person who refuses to accept that we have to choose between living in the places we love and being safe. My grandmother carried this knowledge from Mexico to California. My cousin Carmen preserved it in her village. I proved it could work in the modern world. But all of us were just links in a chain that goes back centuries and must continue for centuries more. You are the next links in that chain. You are the seed keepers now. You are the ones who will carry this knowledge forward, who will adapt it to new conditions, who will teach it to your children and grandchildren. The work is hard. People will mock you. They will call your ideas primitive or crazy or naive. They will build the way they've always built, and then lose everything when fire comes. You will watch people suffer who didn't have to suffer. You will feel angry and helpless and tired. But you will also watch houses stand that would have burned. You will see families survive who would have been lost. You will know that the work matters, that every person you teach might save lives, that knowledge passed on is the only legacy that truly endures. The earth protects itself. We just have to let it. We just have to remember what our ancestors knew and what we almost forgot. Build well. Teach clearly. Remember always. The mountains keep what we give them. Maya Castellanos. She sent the email to her apprentices, to her students, to the network of builders and teachers and advocates who had grown from one woman with a crazy idea about grassroots into a movement that was changing how people build in fire country. Then she closed her laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, crickets and wind, and the distant call of an owl. The sounds of a landscape recovering from fire, as it had recovered 1,000 times before, as it would recover 1,000 times again. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rosa Sanchez, her partner in building the center, now retired but still offering guidance. Saw the news. 35 out of 37. That's not luck. That's proof. Well done, Maya. Maya smiled and texted back. Not me. My grandmother. Carmen. All the women who came before. And you, Rosa, insisted. Don't diminish what you've done. You took knowledge that almost died and made it live again. You save lives. You change how people build. That's legacy. Maya thought about that. Legacy. She had always resisted the word, felt like it, suggested the work was finished, that she could rest on accomplishments and stop pushing forward. But maybe legacy wasn't about finishing. Maybe it was about planting seeds that would grow long after the garden was gone. She had planted seeds, thousands of them, in the students she had taught, the homes that had been built, the techniques that had spread across continents. In young Carmen's bright eyes as she learned why her abuela had built their home with a grass roof, in the building codes that were changing, in the architects who were learning to respect traditional knowledge, the seeds were growing. They would continue growing long after Maya was gone. That was enough. That was everything. 31 years after the Cascade Fire, Maya Castellanos died peacefully in her sleep on a cold November night, in the cabin she had built 3 decades earlier, under the living roof that had saved her life and proven to the world that the old ways still worked. She was 72 years old. The funeral was held on a hillside above Pine Ridge, in sight of the cabin and the community she had transformed. Over 800 people came, students and neighbors and architects and building officials. The girl named Rosa, now a woman, who brought her daughter Carmen, Tom Brennan, 90 years old, who had lived long enough to see the house he had once mocked outlast everything else in the valley. They buried her in a simple ceremony, in a grave site she had chosen herself. Her grandmother's journal, a copy, the original remained in the National Archives, was placed beside her. Carmen's letters, translated and bound, the metal she had never quite known what to do with, and seeds, native grass seeds from her roof. Students came forward one by one and scattered them over the fresh earth, letting them fall where they would, trusting they would grow. Rosa Sanchez spoke at the service, her voice breaking as she talked about her friend, her partner, her teacher. Maya wanted to tell you that this work isn't finished, Rosa said, that there are still communities to teach, still techniques to document, still knowledge to preserve. She would want you to remember that she was just one link in a very long chain, that the real heroes are the women whose names we'll never know, who kept this knowledge alive through centuries of change and loss. But I'm going to say what Maya wouldn't. She was a hero, too. She took knowledge that almost died and brought it back to life. She proved that traditional wisdom could save modern lives. She taught thousands of people to build differently, and those people are teaching thousands more. Rosa looked out at the assembled crowd, at the faces young and old, at the community that had gathered to honor a woman who had never sought honor. The best way to remember Maya is to continue her work. Build well, teach clearly, remember that the earth protects itself if we let it, and pass that knowledge on to everyone who needs it. The mountains keep what we give them. Maya gave them everything she had. Now it's our turn. Present day, 40 years after the Cascade Fire, the young architect stood in front of Maya Castellanos' cabin, now a historical landmark and teaching site, with her students, explaining the principles that had been revolutionary 40 years ago and were standard practice now. Living roofs are common now, she said. Building codes in 17 states require or incentivize them in fire-prone areas. But it started here. One woman with a crazy idea about grass roofs and the determination to prove it could work. The students took notes, measured wall thickness, examined the irrigation systems that had been upgraded but followed the original design. The cabin was 73 years old now. The walls were settling beautifully. The roof was in its 14th generation of grass. It had survived 6 major fires. It would survive 6 more. Maya Castellanos didn't invent these techniques, the architect continued. That's important to understand. She preserved them. She adapted them. She proved they worked. But the knowledge came from her grandmother, who brought it from Mexico. And before that, from generations of builders whose names we'll never know. That's what makes traditional ecological knowledge so important. It's not just information. It's survival wisdom, tested and refined over centuries. When we ignore it because it seems primitive, when we replace it with modern materials that fail under stress, we're not being innovative. We're being arrogant. One of the students raised her hand. How many lives has this knowledge saved? The architect smiled. We'll never know exactly. Thousands, certainly. maybe tens of thousands when you count all the homes built worldwide using these principles. But every life saved is because someone listened, someone learned, someone chose to build differently. That's Maya's real legacy. Not this cabin, though it's beautiful, not the awards or the recognition, but the knowledge that continues spreading, the chain that didn't break. The students dispersed to examine different aspects of the cabin, to see for themselves how earth and water and roots worked together, how thermal mass regulated temperature, how living systems provided better protection than manufactured materials. The architect stayed behind, standing in the clearing where Maya had stood 40 years earlier, watching the world burn and her cabin survive. She thought about the letter Maya had written to the next generation of seed keepers. The architect had received a copy when she was a student, studying sustainable design at Berkeley. That letter had changed her life, had convinced her that traditional knowledge mattered, that the old ways deserved respect and preservation. Now she taught those principles to her own students, and they would teach them to others, and the knowledge would continue spreading, adapting, evolving, but always rooted in the understanding that the earth protected itself. You just had to let it. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and sage. Somewhere on the hillside, native grasses were growing. Seeds Maya had planted decades ago, still growing, still spreading, still fulfilling the purpose for which they had been sown. The mountains kept what you gave them. Maya Castellanos had given them everything, and the mountains remembered. They would remember for a very long time.